Thank you very much, Anders, and welcome to everybody here today. So my name is Victoria Gardner, as Anders has already outlined, and I'm here today in my role as chair of STM's Open Research Committee. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank the organisers at JST and STM for this session. I've already learned a lot from it, and also thank you to those of you listening in today for your time. So Anders has provided the title of the talk. I'd like in my time today to cover the points you can see on the slide here. So this will include a quick introduction to author rights and copyright rights, an overview of some of the key international copyright conventions, some reflections on the implications of the digital age for copyright, some views on copyright, including some points and counterpoints that I hope will provoke further discussion, an overview of licensing in the open access content and sharing some views from our author base on this topic, and some concluding remarks. If there's one thing I'd like you to take from this talk today, it's that we believe that there is a place for copyright in the digital context, and would argue that it is even more critical in the digital environment in terms of preserving research integrity, building trust in information, and incentivizing creativity. So at my company, Taylor & Francis, we do believe that copyright and the principles of open access and open science can work together to support rigor, version control, and research integrity. So let's move on. Some basics on author rights and copyright. So the protection of the moral and the material interest from an author's scientific, literary, or artistic production is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specifically Article 27(2). Along with the right of free expression, which includes the concepts of academic freedom and the protection from censorship, copyright has informed the foundations of Western thought since the 17th century. And as I said before, I believe that this has really encouraged and spurred creativity. Some important features of copyright. So copyright is technology neutral. It doesn't assume or require the use of a particular type of technology. It's technology agnostic. So why does this matter in the discussion today? It means that copyright aligns to the broader principles around academic freedom and freedom of expression, which are included in that Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And those high-level principles apply whatever medium. Next, copyright protects both original and derivative works, so useful to keep that in mind. Another important point is that copyright arises automatically. So again, it supports creativity. There are a couple of different traditions. So there's the Anglo-American tradition versus the French droit d'auteur, or right of the author. In the interest of time, I won't spend lots of time on these two different concepts, but essentially this is about rights to a legal author, which might be a company, which is supported more through the Anglo-American model, versus rights to a human author, which is more the French system. And the France droit d'auteur has been especially influential in the development of international conventions around copyright, such as the Berne Convention. The last point to note here is that lead and co-authors are covered by national laws, but typically only the lead author enters into a publishing agreement. I will talk about this slide fairly briefly in the interest of time, but I think the key points to mention here is that copyright doesn't sit in a vacuum. It's covered by various international measures, and these have been in place for over 100 years, as you can see on the timeline. The Berne Convention, which I mentioned before, it deals with the protection of works and the rights of authors, and it provides creators, which include authors, but also other creators, the means to control how their works are used, by whom, and what terms they can be reused. So the other conventions are listed here. Just a couple of points to signpost. So these conventions tend to cover elements such as standards, enforcement, and dispute settlement. And the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, Copyright Treaty, also grants certain economic rights to creators. It's important to note that despite the international conventions, copyright remains territorial, so an important consideration. So moving from the print to the digital context poses particular considerations that need to be addressed. And as I said at the start, our thesis is that copyright is actually even more critical in the digital environment in terms of preserving research integrity, building trust in information, and incentivizing creativity. This is so important given that digital copies, unlike print copies, are easy to reproduce, they don't deteriorate, and they can be easily widespread. Now, there are lots of benefits to this, of course, but it does make the tracking and ascertaining the provenance of these digital versions more difficult and challenging. Specifically in the academic publishing context, it makes updating all of these versions with corrections and retracting where needed challenging as well. So it is really important to ensure appropriate use, reuse, and attribution to preserve that research integrity and to prevent misinformation. I do have to mention AI. We haven't mentioned it so far today, but the advent of tools like ChatGPT and other generative AI technology, which use content from any possible source for training, it exacerbates the challenge of credible provenance, and it highlights the need to understand where content is coming from and to support appropriate attribution. So we think that copyright is the vehicle to support the development of a robust, transparent, and trustable digital environment, and to support that continued human-led creativity and innovation. On a slightly different note, I wanted to provoke some discussion by sharing some thoughts I hear from those who feel that copyright doesn't have a role in the digital context. So I've provided some of those common views, but also some counterpoints on the right-hand side of the slide. So firstly, copyright is a print artifact. As I mentioned before, copyright is technology neutral, and importantly so. So the principles, those ideals that it supports, like the expression of ideas, are especially relevant in the digital context. With the rise of misinformation, copyright, attribution, knowing where content has come from is even more important in supporting research integrity and signposting trustable information. The next point, copyright prevents innovation. We'd counter that actually copyright ensures that creators receive credit for their work, and it encourages the creation of new work. Copyright also allows publishers to present work in new ways in the future. It supports future innovation and the communication and the expression of ideas in new ways to new audiences. The next point, copyright is in opposition to open access. I believe that copyright actually provides a framework that supports many of the principles of open research, such as transparency and authorship. Creative Commons licenses, which are used to support open access publishing, in fact include some of the principles that are inherent in copyright, including the concept of a moral right of attribution, which Professor Funamori mentioned earlier. Lastly, assigning copyright to publishers takes away authors' rights. Actually, authors assigning copyright to Taylor and Francis are still credited. They can still reuse their own work. They can still share with colleagues. They can print. They can post their accepted manuscripts to a repository, typically after an embargo period. Most publishers also support text and data mining, though this is often on non-commercial terms. So by authors assigning copyright to publishers, they give publishers the right to protect their works on their behalf against, for example, copyright infringement. So moving on to focus specifically on open access licenses. As noted earlier, we believe that copyright and the principles of open access and open research can work together to support rigor, version control, and research integrity. While we do have copyright across much of our content, we've also offered Creative Commons licenses to our authors for over a decade. And as noted before, these licenses have many attributes in common with copyright assignment. I think that the graphic on this slide will be of interest to listeners today. This is from our 2019 researcher survey, where we surveyed authors for their views and their preferences on a range of licenses. And this included Creative Commons licenses alongside copyright and license to publish. We'd also surveyed authors in 2014 on this topic, so that's why you can see 2 bars against each of the responses. So of the options presented, authors actually indicated that their top 3 licenses in 2019 were an exclusive license to publish, a copyright assignment, or a Creative Commons license, but this was the non-commercial, no derivatives, so a fairly restrictive license in terms of reuse. We infer from this that researchers themselves like to have licenses that put them in control of how their work is reused. I do want to note, and as on the previous slide, we do offer Creative Commons attribution licenses. And you can see here that it is the main open access license. If you look at publishers across the board, this data comes from Lens. So Creative Commons attribution is the main open access license, but it's not the only option out there. I did want to go back to the survey because I think what would be of interest to this group today is what authors think about posting of their accepted manuscript and their original manuscript. So these are the versions that Professor Funamori discussed earlier. So again, the Creative Commons non-commercial no derivatives license and the license to publish options were the most popular. As noted before, we do allow authors to post their original manuscript with no embargo, and their accepted manuscript can be posted to a repository with an embargo. If publishing open access, of course, with the version of record open access, that published version can be placed in a repository from point of publication. So a few reflections on open access licenses and how these sit with copyright. As I noted before, copyright assignment does allow publishers to protect authors' copyright and their rights. And indeed, publishers tend to have the resources and the expertise to pursue claims on authors' behalf. As I noted before, publishers offer and support a range of open access licenses because we're moving towards a more open access landscape, and we want to respect researcher wishes and offer them the choice and flexibility, as well as supporting open access mandates and policies. As I've noted before, publishers use copyright transfers and exclusive licenses to protect research integrity, and a specific use case is to flag instances where content has been reproduced without permission. So we often use in plagiarism checking tools. On this last point, especially in an immediate open access environment, the ability of publishers to receive copyright transfer or an exclusive license also supports various business models. And this includes subscriptions, but a whole host of other models, including potentially new models. And it's this last point I want to stress. Copyright does support future innovation because, as I said before, it allows publishers to present content in the future in new formats to new audiences. And it could allow research outcomes to have influence and impact long after publication. A few reflections on some guiding principles for author rights based on our experience working in this environment, the feedback from our authors, and what we have done to support open access mandates and compliance, as well as traditional copyright. So, as I've said before, there is value in offering flexibility on licenses to suit the needs and circumstances of authors. We do think that a one-size-fits-all approach can be challenging, and we've especially found this in humanities, arts, and social sciences contexts, where scholars generally favour more restrictive licenses to allow them some control in how their work is reused. On the next point, academic freedom is inconsistent with demands that restrict author choice. So the efforts that restrict an author's right to enter into contracts or direct further uses can be seen to undermine that academic freedom and author choice. And I would cite the so-called rights retention strategy in this context as well. An unintended consequence of the rights retention strategy, as we understand it, is that it also perpetuates a subscription model, which really runs in opposition to our mutual goals around driving open access. And although it's called rights retention, as we understand it, it's really about authors and researchers releasing their rights and relinquishing the ability to have a say in how their work is reused in the future. So losing that control that many do value. As noted in early slides, copyright and open access licenses do support quality and integrity of the system through that inherent moral right of attribution and often work together. And finally, we really do believe that there is a means to broker mutually agreeable outcomes through discussion, experimentation, and collaboration. So the growth of open access in places such as Germany and the Netherlands, which do have those secondary publication rights regimes, in fact, that growth is due to agreements and partnerships brokered by publishers and libraries together. It's not so much because of green open access. So there's not a lot of content being placed in repositories. It is more through those transformative agreements that we're seeing the move towards open access. So Professor Akaike's reflections on collaboration and stakeholder cooperation in implementing Japan's open access policy are very welcome. So to reiterate the two themes of this talk, you can see a couple of points in the box here. We do believe that author rights, copyrights, and open access can work together. They can provide protection for authors. They can ensure robust information. They can incentivize creativity. And STM publisher members, we support and we manage and we protect author rights, which is really important in the digital context, especially given the rise of misinformation and disinformation. Like I said before, we do believe that copyright supports creativity and onward innovation. So with that, I'll thank the STM team for their support with preparing this talk, JST for their coordination and for this event, and all of you for your time and attention. And I'll now hand back to Anders-san. Thank you.
Thank you,